How did the $6 million man come into my life? I was asked to come to Universal Studios to do a pioneering thing, to make the first miniseries out of the Irwin Shaw novel, Rich Man, Poor Man. And I spent my first year or two at Universal developing that. And ABC kind of lost faith in the miniseries concept. So suddenly I was making movies of the week and doing other things. When $6 Million Man was first filmed as a movie of the week, Bionic Man, after the second or third movie of the week, Frank Price, who was then head of television for Universal, called me to his office. He said, how would you like to make a series out of $6 Million Man? I said, well, I loved the first movie. Let me think about it. He said, well, don't think too long because you have to be on the air in 6 weeks. I said, you are kidding me. He said, no. Well, I said, the first thing I better do is take a look at all the movies of the week that have been made, which I did. And I got to tell you, I thought it was insane to try to do that in 6 weeks. It probably is. If there hadn't been a great desire to do it, if there hadn't been an incredibly accessible studio. I mean, the Universal in those days was the last of the great movie studios. Anything you needed was there. I'd like a World War II tank, you got it. I mean, it was unbelievable. I said, all right, I'll try it. To this day, I think I was nuts to do that, but I thought we'd give it a try. The first thing that I did was to address the fact that I thought the second two of the movies of the week had not fulfilled the promise of the first. I think the reason for that was Lee Majors was misused. James Bond was very au courant then. So somehow, whoever took over the second movies decided it ought to be a bionic James Bond. Well, you put Lee Majors in a blue ruffled tuxedo shirt, and it's like putting Gary Cooper in a blue ruffled tuxedo shirt. It just didn't make much sense. So the first thing I did was to say, guys, we've got to use Lee Majors as who he is. Frank Price said, well, who is he? I said, he's Gary Cooper. And I remember seeing a scene in, I think, the first movie where Lee comes out of the desert in some fashion with a toothpick in his mouth. That image will always be, for me, the Lee Majors that we wanted to use as the $6 Million Man, to humanize him, to make him a cowboy without a horse. So we set to work. And I don't know quite how we did it. It was a combination of great personnel, frenetic rewrite, conceptual planning. We did it. I went back and saw the first movie, and what impressed me was Lee's hold on an audience, that he should be a man barely alive, that he should have the humanness. In a sense, he was like a wounded soldier to me. And his ability to rebound. Forget that it was super prosthetics and things like that. The fact is he was he was in tatters, and we had to rebuild him. His courage in tackling that and staying together just impressed me terrifically. And I thought, this is the guy, we can make him a hero, but we don't have to make him Superman. That became my kind of the theme of the show, that to play against his superior powers and remember that they were, after all, an invention to continue his life. I had come off of a successful series called Mod Squad, which is when I went to Universal. And in Mod Squad, I had learned how hard you have to work to build a team and to keep it together. But in Mod Squad, we had 7 shooting days. At Universal, the standard was 6. So in addition to everything else, 6 weeks to do a year's work and 6 days to shoot it in, I needed the best of the best. I brought in people who had worked for me on Mod Squad. The studio, Universal, said, who do you need? What do you want? And I think we got the best of the best. And then the studio was so well-staffed. There wasn't anything you couldn't get at Universal Studios at that time. So we had hundreds of people working round the clock, really. The key ingredient was getting a script done, and that was my job. So what does a producer do? What does a producer-writer do? The modern term, not used then but now, is showrunner, and it's much more accurate as to what is done. The showrunner is chief of staff. He tends to be the idea person, and most importantly, he is the rewrite man. And that was what I did for the first couple of weeks. Without a good script, you have no chance of making anything, let alone in a short period of time. Once the script was finished, we just, first draft, let's go, bang. There wasn't time to do a second draft. We rewrote as we went. When the 6 weeks were up and we literally delivered a wet print to the network, that wasn't the end of the pressure. The reason for that is there was another week, and another week, and another week. We were a series. So the pressure didn't stop for probably 3 or 4 weeks after the 6 weeks, when the network graciously preempted us, meaning putting some other show on in our slot. I think we had the first 2 or 3 episodes were aired on schedule. And after that, there was an interruption, and that gave us some time. Not that there was much time, but enough to build up a sense of backlog in our story material. I think the wonderful thing was that the cast was basically aware of who they were playing, so we didn't have pilot-itis of what is my motivation and who am I. So that was easy to explain, and Lee was terrific. He was delighted to be doing a series, and he did it automatically. The only superhero on television historically had been Superman. George Reeves played Superman and many since. But we didn't want to do Superman. I, who subsequently became identified with science fiction, have never been a science fiction person. I have been about heroes. I come from a generation, the sons of World War II. We believed in heroes. That belief has been eroded by all kinds of things since. Maybe it's returning now, I hope so. But that was our mission. We wanted to do a story about the kind of heroes that we had known during those frightening 5 years of World War II. Lee Majors had that quality of being Sergeant York, of being an American hero, Audie Murphy. You know, those are the people that were shaping our vision for him. How can you do that when a guy has these powers? The answer is you play against the powers. I mean, anybody can pick up a car, but to pick up a car with love and purpose, that was kind of the guiding motto of the show. When did we know? You know, I knew on the first night. The fact that the tune-in was so good, the fact that the ratings were much higher than you would expect for a new show which had not been promoted as a new show. It didn't have a whole summer of promos, but we got big turn-in. And then it continued. There was no serious drop-off in week 2, even though we felt that it was kind of a ragged second episode for good reason. But we began to feel we had an audience out there, an audience who might stay with us, and they did. Steve Austin and Lee had become a brand, that is true, but I cannot remember the ratings of the original Bionic movie. There was a manufactured trailer about what the stories were going to be, implying there would be a series. My memory of that trailer was not enthused. I thought there were clumsy storyettes and not the kind of story that ultimately we chose to do. So Lee was our ace in the hole. We were really selling Lee Majors as a leading man, and he was up to that challenge. The world will little note nor long remember, to quote Lincoln, that I discovered Lee Majors. Oh, you say? How is that? Well, the untold story is when I was head of development for ABC, the same network that did $6 Million Man, we were developing a series called The Big Valley. Big Valley was done by 3 marvelous producers, Gardner, Levy, and Lavin. And I got a call 2 weeks before shooting. They said, we don't have the part of Heath. And we have found a guy who's a physical instructor at North Hollywood Park, and we think he can play the part. Ooh, I said, okay. He said, can you come over? It was 7 o'clock at night. We shot a quick test of him and see what you think. So at 8 o'clock one night, out in the valley, they ran a test of Lee Majors. My first impression was he looked terrifically like Elvis Presley, which he did, kind of. And he had the Elvis without all the shenanigans and bang bang and hip swinging. He had that Tennessee thing. More than that, I believed him. I said, you want him? They said, yeah, we got it. We don't know who else to. I said, okay, he's Heath. And I called Tom Moore, who was the president of ABC, who I reached at a nightclub, I think, somewhere. I said, Tom, I think we found Heath for Big Valley. He said, who is it? I told him, well, you don't know him. He's an unknown actor, but he looks like Elvis Presley. Oh, he said, go ahead, cast him. Thus, Lee Majors became Heath in The Big Valley, which was his breakthrough part. I think Lee Majors appreciated being with Barbara Stanwyck. I had the privilege of being on the Big Valley stage during the shooting of the pilot. And Barbara Stanwyck had not had a scene yet in the pilot. The first scene for her was a wrenching, emotional scene. And she says, she gives him advice, he seeks advice, and she said, "If you were my son, I would say to you," and the rest is pure gold, okay? Barbara Stanwyck has not had a single moment on stage. It's 5 o'clock on the sound stage. They call her, she comes out to do this scene, no rehearsal. She plays it with Lee. Roll 'em, action. For 2 minutes, Barbara Stanwyck made us all cry on the stage. I think if Lee Majors had not been so absolutely absorbed with what she was saying, he might have cried. When it was all over, the director, Billy Graham, said, "Cut. Miss Stanwyck, would you like to do it again?" She said, "Do you want me to?" He said, "No." She said, "Thank you." And she smiled at everybody and went back to her dressing room. It was the most professional thing I had ever seen. And Lee was stunned by it. I think he became a student of Barbara Stanwyck at that moment in time. I think Lee Majors was heavily influenced by Barbara Stanwyck's professionalism. I mean, after all, it was his first big-time shoot, and she was incredible. Like so many actors of that period, and I had a later experience with Ingrid Bergman, who was the same. Totally professional, stayed on the set to do off-camera lines for other actors, on time, no temperament. I think it was a matrix that Lee adopted quickly, because that's the way he was on the $6 Million set. And thank God, because with all the time pressures we were under to get the first few episodes on the air, any display of non-professionalism would have killed us. Lee's concept of Steve Austin was absolutely perfect in the first movie. Again, he was not asked to be James Bond. He was asked to be a dust kicker, if you will, a cowboy. A scene that stayed in my mind from the first film and became an image for me, if not for him, was him with a toothpick hanging out of his mouth. Okay. Yep. Nope. And he was comfortable. He was comfortable being a Gary Cooper-esque kind of guy. Probably it goes back to his own roots, his Southern heritage, his concept of speak softly and carry a big stick. All of it had a modesty that was perfect for a guy who had such power. From the very first day, in the first day's dailies, we knew we had the right guy in the right part, and all we had to do was keep perpetuating that kind of attitude. Richard Anderson was the perfect complement to him. Richard Anderson is responsible for the word pal, so frequently used by all of us in the 6 Mil family. He uses it a lot, and it's infectious. I used to think how blessed I was to have Richard and Lee, because Richard represented old Hollywood. Most people don't know it, but as a very young man, Richard was part of the MGM stable. I think he married Irving Thalberg's daughter, as I remember. And his heritage came from that kind of professional, old school, Claudette Colbert, uh, Barbara Stanwyck. Lee was learning all this and was new school in the sense of Lee wasn't a method actor, which was in vogue in those days, yet he was as natural as any of the method actors that we admired at the time. His method was being himself, and it was perfect. So the combination of Richard and that kind of persuasiveness, and Lee, who, was always a little bit wary of authority, but who accepted Oscar Goldman's authority because it was done with such charm. I also was very much taken. I never quite understood why the choice was made, but Oscar Goldman, a Jewish CIA agent, was unusual. Not that it was of any importance, and we certainly didn't play it, but it was kind of comforting to know that everybody in this country was represented in this great national defense kind of organization. I knew that Richard Anderson was perfect to continue on as Oscar Goldman because he had the voice, was the voice of authority. The handsomeness. Richard is one of those people who got more handsome as he aged. It's an amazing thing. The robustness, the tan. He represented the best in what we would call the governmental mindset. He was human, and he was a patriot. And patriotism is an underlying issue in $6 Million Man. It isn't, we didn't wave the flag a lot, but there's an awful lot of stuff with Lee in his uniform, in an Air Force uniform. Every once in a while we do that as part of a story to remind people that yes, he was an astronaut, but above all, he was a pilot, he was a soldier, and he was an American soldier. The opening of $6 Million Man, which has been, of course, the hallmark of the show, is narrated by Richard Anderson, with one exception. We needed a line after Richard recorded, and I wrote the line, and I couldn't find Richard, so I did it myself. The line is, I gotta, get back in my acting gear. Steve Austin, astronaut, a man barely alive. That's me, and always will be me, and I'm looking forward to hearing it a lot. In going to series, I knew we needed an opening which did several things. Number one, it had to reprise the story of the original movie and of Martin Caidin's book. Number two, it had to set the tone of an action-adventure show. And number three, we wanted to humanize the fact that this was a man who was near death and who had been revived and was now capable of remarkable things. The footage of Peterson's crash was terrifying to me. I'm a pilot. I learned to fly not in the military. And I have an affinity for, did a lot of flying movies, worked with Frank Tolman, who also worked with us on $6 Million Man, a great stunt flyer. And I was, first of all, I had to research what actually happened to Peterson. And I found out that while coming in, the landing body dropped from an airplane, gliding to space, a test really of what later became the shuttle. I mean, ultimately. As he was coming in for a landing, a normal, perfect approach, a press helicopter crossed his path inadvertently, causing him to move the joystick just enough to avoid the helicopter, and he lost control and tumbled and all that you see actually was the frightening crash. I met Mr. Peterson, or Colonel Peterson, later. He was the bionic man. He had prosthetics and he had a voice device. And it was frightening when you first met him because he sounded artificial, but he was a remarkable officer and a true hero. So we wanted to reflect that in the main title. I think we achieved that. Now that takes us to one of, I would say without modesty, one of my great contributions to $6 Million Man. I was a fan, and still am a fan, of NFL films. And as a fan of NFL films, anyone who has ever seen them knows that they shoot at 94 frames a second in order to show great power. Running backs are running very slowly, and as a result, you say, I don't want you running over me. So that became the guideline of how we would show speed, by reversing and showing it so slowly and powerfully. And we did it first in the main title. We had some stuff that had been shot for the original movie where he was actually running very fast. So the combination of extreme slow motion with just an occasional burst of speed became the matrix for how to sell a man who could run at 60 miles an hour. The main title established all his powers so that once you were into an episode, you no longer had to explain for the first-time viewer or even for the fan who he was and what he could do. The medical advances alluded to in $6 Million Man were actually on the planning boards of many medical and science centers all over the country. In some sense, we haven't quite fulfilled the promise of the main title, and in another sense, we have. Certainly the advance in prosthetics for guys coming home from the Iraqi war are the ultimate chapter of what we knew in the 70s, and just the threshold of, hopefully, of what we can do in the future. While I was making the show, I was not really aware of its impact on people who would need prosthetic aids later in their lives. There is no audience in television that the filmmaker can feel. You send a can of film or tape to a transmission center, and it gets beamed out to the entire nation or the world. But you don't hear the breathing, and you don't hear the laughter, and you don't hear the audience response. The fourth wall, we call that in the theater when I was a student. It was only later when I did feature pictures that I could sit in the audience and have that final satisfaction. As it affected me on $6 Million Man, I didn't get feedback until much later, long after the show was gone and I was on something else. And then people would come and say, oh, you did the $6 Million Man? Yes. Wow, that changed my life because, or I'm hoping to do because. And then I began to realize the impact of Steve Austin's help, physical, scientific help, as a ray of hope for many people. And I felt proud of that. When I signed on to do $6 Million Man, one of the first things I tried to do was to connect with Martin Caidin, author of the original books. And he came to LA, and we had an afternoon together, or as much time as I could spare with the deadlines we were under. He was a remarkable fella, and I think we talked more about the commonality of our flying. His take was much more science fiction oriented than what I wanted to do. As mentioned, I wanted to humanize the $6 Million Man. And I think he was much more involved with the science, with the futuristic possibilities. We could make him better, better, better. And that was fascinating, but not immediately helpful for the task at hand. So he and I corresponded. He wrote some very pleasant things to me afterward, after seeing some of the episodes. But his involvement was limited to that. The other person that I was very much indebted to, not too many people know that the original movie, the best of the bunch, was ghostwritten by a friend of mine and a fellow Universal producer who has gone on to a few hits. His name is Steve Bochco. And Steve, who once said to me, "You got too many series on the air, you're making us all look bad." Well, Steve then went on to do 3 or 4 multiple series at the same time. The main thing with Steve was that I think his rewrite of the original Bionic movie began to capture that humanness that I treasured in the character. In addition to that, as the series moved on and caught on, a series showrunner is always looking for people who can write for his show. They're hard to find. Steve Bochco, who was very busy doing his own stuff, became a recruiter for me. He would call me, says, "Okay, I got somebody for you." And they all came from Carnegie Tech, which is his alma mater. The first of these was Kenny Johnson, who became my right hand. And the second was James Perriott, who became my left hand. These 2 gifts from Steve Bochco to a showrunner saying, "What'll we shoot next Monday?" were heavenly. And those guys became the coach, the backfield coach, the quarterback, you name it, when I was just the offensive coordinator up in the tower with us. I said, "Okay, boys, whatever you want to do." There is a triangle of characters, not unlike the triangle I later inherited in Star Trek. There is the doctor, there is the brain, Oscar Goldman in this case, and there is the hero, the captain, in this case, Steve Austin. When Alan Oppenheimer decided not to come back, I played tennis on a wonderful tennis court in North Hollywood, Encino actually. Played tennis on a wonderful tennis court, and Marty Brooks was one of the players. So was Dick Van Patten, whose son Vince later became the Bionic Boy. So you can see it was a very fertile place to play tennis. Marty and I were good friends. I had liked his work. And when there was a vacancy in the hospital, I thought he could bring a very special quality to it. In a sense, it was more medical, more authoritative in the sense of Dr. Rudy Wells. That quality of, I know what I'm doing. And we cast him, and he proved to be exactly that. He was stable, He was more than your family doctor. He was the futuristic fella, after all, who was scientist more than doctor, in a sense. I do remember that when Alan left, we had to consider the possibility, was Rudy Wells expendable? After all, he had pioneered the material, the operation, the prosthetics, everything else, but was he there as a mechanic? Once Marty got on into the part, we began to realize again that his corner of the triangle was an important one. We could utilize certain things experimentally and scientifically that we couldn't without such a character. My favorite episode was called Burning Bright. It was my first encounter with William Shatner in what became a lifelong friendship and professional association later. It was written by Del Reisman, who was president of the Writers Guild at that moment. It was about another astronaut who had been exposed to, we don't know, out there in space. Remember, we had just landed on the moon not that long before. The very reasons that Peterson had crashed in his landing body and created this attention on the space program. The very reason was mysteries of outer space. So Shatner plays an astronaut who has become a phenomenon. He has become brilliant. He is becoming more brilliant, but he is burning out. And ultimately, at the end of the episode, he dies in space, even as Steve attempts to rescue him and bring him back. It was one of the few real sci-fi episodes from a guy who wanted to humanize the hero, but has also, I have loved the space program and that element of it. Shatner was wonderful. That's when I learned that Bill Shatner was more than a matinee idol. He was a hell of an actor. Stylized? Yes. Brilliant? Also. My favorite scene, I think, was in episode 2 or 3. It was early on. If you want to talk about humanizing the $6 Million Man, this is the scene that did it for me. Oscar and Steve are in a car going to an appointment. Poof! Flat tire. Oscar says, in effect, rent a car, I don't have a jack. Why are we out here in the middle of nothing and I can't, because. And Steve doesn't say anything. He just says, opens the door and goes outside. And I think Oscar says, where are you going? We have to, and he really is panicked. One of the few times that Richard Anderson was asked to play panic. We're on Richard, and suddenly the car begins to lift. And we cut outside, and it is Steve Austin, astronaut, lifting the car with his bionic arm. And I think he says something like, well, don't just sit there, Oscar. Come out here and change the tire. I loved it. In trying to humanize the character and cover a broad pathway so that we didn't become fixated as a superhero sci-fi show, we just went to a range of stories. The addition of Kenny. Kenny has a wonderful imagination. And I guess if there was any problem I ever had with Kenny, it was reining in his enthusiasm, because he is a terrific enthusiast. As witnessed by his work and his later work in Hulk. I mean, the guy has a boundless imagination. And ultimately, when Jim Perriott joined our happy band, Jim has a gentleness. So I had this wonderful orchestra of players off the camera as well as on, and we could do almost anything. I mean, bionic boy, bionic dog. We did. At one point, the joke in our crowd was, the next show we do will be called the Bionic Rabbi. We never did get to that. In the second year, I got a call from Frank Price, the man who had first sicked me onto this project. Frank was not just the head of television at that time at Universal, but he was a distinguished television writer. A writer first, I think. He said, why don't you give him a girl? We need a love interest. We need a girl. I said, okay. And that was the origin of it. We later talked, we had a meeting, and we decided she could be a fellow bionic person. Well, that kind of got things cooking. The result was a lovely, lovely script, and the dilemma of casting. The casting of the Bionic Woman, once we decided to do that story, was an interesting adventure for all of us, and especially for me. We looked at screen tests. Universal at that time had a stable of players. Now, as was typical with Hollywood studio stables, these people were potential stars, potential character players, and they were all under weekly contract. And the weekly contracts were not gigantic. They were good and nice, as they had been for MGM players the decade before and so forth. One of those contract players was Lindsay Wagner. Once I saw Lindsay Wagner, the image of what the Bionic Woman should be was bang. I know she doesn't look like Judy Garland, but she had the quality that Judy Garland affected me with, and that is a wholesomeness, a girl next door quality, a feminine quality. Now, if what we tried to do with Steve Austin was to humanize him in spite of his superpowers, then what we tried to do with the Bionic Woman concept was to keep her a woman. There came a time when Bionic Woman had proved itself. She had returned and we were ready to do a series. And the ultimate decision to make a commitment to pay for such a series, 22 firm, as we used to say in those days, was up to the head of ABC, Fred Silverman. At the same time, he was being offered Wonder Woman on the basis that either one was a female heroine. Well, there's no way you can compare Bionic Woman with Wonder Woman, because Wonder Woman is exactly what we didn't want to do with 6 Mil or Bionic Woman. It's a superhero. It's a lady in tights, you know, boom, boom, boom. She's not the girl next door. She's from another planet, you know, as 'twere. I was surprised that it took Freddie so long to make the obvious decision. And finally he did, and Bionic Woman went to series. And there would not have been a successful series with anyone else but Lindsay. She was the Bionic Woman. Lindsay allowed us to do with Bionic Woman what I call a pastoral version of 6 Mil. And nothing would illustrate that more. The music for 6 Mil that comes in on the main bum, 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 that's Oliver Nelson. Oliver Nelson had died, I believe, before Bionic Woman. Died suddenly. We were thrilled to get Henry Mancini. Great, great composer name in Hollywood. And we told him what we wanted, and he came up with a lyric kind of theme, totally different. The opening of Bionic Woman is a tone poem compared to Steve Austin, Astronaut. But in so doing, it created once and for all the girl next door who, if she has to, can beat your head in, but only for cause and only under duress. And that became the matrix of the show. We do not intend for her to show her powers unless it is imminent danger to herself or others. I'd like to think that the crossovers were my idea because it's such a great idea. And maybe it was. The fact of the matter is, it was not common in American television because there were very few parallel series. There are many more today than there were then. So we were pioneering with he said, she said matrix here. So I think that the idea was self-evident ultimately. Most particularly, we wanted to help the ratings of one with the ratings of the other, and the crossovers blossomed both. That was the wonder of it. One of the highlights of my career from a Nielsen standpoint, when Rich Man, Poor Man was finally completed in the midst of all this bionic success, it hit the air, and for 10 weeks of Rich Man, Poor Man, the Nielsen ratings, remember it was a 3-network economy then, but the Nielsen ratings were Rich Man, Poor Man, $6 Million Man, Bionic Woman, 1, 2, 3, or sometimes 1, 2, 4, or sometimes 1, 3, 4, but always in the top 5. I remember that Freddie Silverman, who was then president of ABC, called me one day and he said, ABC will never forget, which I thought was very dramatic, because he did forget later. Though they were both successful, their appeals were different. Without being a chauvinist, one could almost say that Six Mill's core audience was male, or predominantly male rather, and Bionic Woman was predominantly female. But that would be an exaggeration. Certainly a male audience appreciated Jamie and vice versa. Having both shows on the air and having the actors crossing constantly and working constantly, for one thing, it was a scheduling nightmare. There are times when an actor cannot be in 2 places at one time. So scheduling was always a problem. In terms of the actors being excited about being both shows, who wouldn't be? Who wouldn't be? They were earning big bucks. They were working beyond, time limitations. It was a heady time. On the other hand, we didn't do it every week. We did it on a specialty basis. And it was very exciting. It was very exciting. And it bound 2 shows together as a family in a way that I had never experienced before or since. Lindsay and Lee had an affinity for each other. She played well off of his quietude, and he played well off her sincerity. If I'm not mistaken, if my memory is at all working, Farrah Fawcett, the divine Farrah Fawcett, who guest starred many times with us on 6 Mill, was Lee's lady at the time. They were dating and more. So there was no You know, it wasn't like the great romance off screen. They were great, good friends, and I think great professional couple together. We had a wonderful casting director, Joe Rich, and he touted Saxon. He said, Saxon can do this. I thought of him in different terms from what I had seen of his work. When he played the robot, he shocked me. I was deeply impressed by his ability to shed everything else he'd done as an actor and become totally robotic. It was a wonderful episode. You know, when you have a fight like that, and the actors themselves are doing most of the stunt work, it's a little scary. You keep hoping nobody gets hurt. Another sequence, another episode, actually, that had that kind of machismo. We did a football episode, and we had a little game of tackle between a twosome and a foursome, the foursome all being NFL stars. It was choreographed by Terry Donahue, who was then the football coach at UCLA. Later went on to the 49ers, I think. That was scary because they were playing, you know, without pads. And Lee Majors, if he had never achieved anything else, would have impressed me with the length he could throw a forward pass. Gorgeous, spiral, 70-yard pass, marvelous. We wanted guest stars whenever we could get them because they meant ratings. But it would be safe to say that Universal was not a money bag studio. 6-day shooting schedule where everybody else was doing 7. This was a studio that was very tightly controlled and very masterfully controlled. It showed a profit, which isn't always easy to do in television business. So we didn't have huge bucks to attract guest stars. What we did was we would always put feelers out and hope that some of these larger names would love to be with us, and many did. And that accounts for how we got Shatner and Stephanie Powers and such, as well as certain personal contacts that Richard Anderson and later Lee Majors provided. When I first met Farrah Fawcett, I could hardly breathe. She was everything that poster we all remember, that iconic wind in the hair. She was unbelievably beautiful. But more importantly, she was a hometown girl. She had that winning charm of, gosh, all fish hooks, I'm just a girl. Of all the guest stars that we had, because of her relationship with Lee, I probably saw more of her than I did of any others off stage. We played tennis together. And we had, had some dinners together and all that. Of all the stars, as I said, who visited our show or were guest stars, I suppose I spent more time enjoying her company than anybody else. I think Lee and Farrah were beautiful together. There wasn't quite the emphasis then on Hollywood gossip, Inquirer kind of stuff. They were just a couple, as my God, as Gable and Lombard had been in my youth. They were a beautiful couple. I can't begin, there's several parallels probably today. But if I mention them now, they may split up by tomorrow, so I won't. Well, who could not remember that great man? I came at that from a different perspective than many of the other people because I had studied Houseman and Orson Welles and the Mercury Players when I was in college, when I was at UCLA. And so he was a reverential figure to me, and I was just honored to have him on the show. This was during his renaissance, you know, his 70-year-old rebirth. While I was waiting for Rich Man, Poor Man to be green-lighted, and before I started the 6 Mil adventure, I was doing movies of the week like once every couple of months. I did one called The Astronaut, starring Monty Markham and Susan Clark, who was also a contract player at Universal then. Jackie Cooper was in it. It was an amazing, amazing picture. I have not run it in a long time. But Monty Markham played an astronaut who goes to Mars and discovers there's a fatal illness in the Martian atmosphere. He dies there. And Monty Markham, a lookalike, is groomed so as to pretend that he has returned safely. That's the story. Well, Monty gave such a performance, and Susan Clark gave such a performance. I'll never forget it. And so I've always been reverential about good old Monty. Well, I don't know about raising the bar, but it was certainly moving the bar. We wanted, and I think we achieved, a stunt content that was not being seen elsewhere. I mean, who jumps over barns? And by the way, I was on the ground watching when Vince Dietrich jumped backwards off a roof in slow-mo so that he could get back on top of the roof and jump forward. And when spliced together, they became... That was a classic example of the way we were thinking in terms of what you could do with bionic ability that nobody else in television could do. It wasn't the flying capes of Superman. It had a kind of wink to it, a kind of sense of humor. Lee always wanted to do his stunts. I think it was part of his machismo. It's always the job of the showrunner and the producers to say, well, not this time, if there's any danger involved. I know today, for example, Tom Cruise makes a religion out of doing his own stunts. Lee did his share. And it was always with the approval of Vince. Vince, can he do this? Is he going to hurt himself? Yeah. Curiously enough, when he hurt himself in the football episode, that was not so much a stunt as just vividly playing football in the scene. When you're making a television series and the star goes down for any reason, you're in big trouble. There is no vacation period. There is no way to say, okay, we'll do it again. We'll start the episode next week. There is no next week. You're on the air. So no one controls the destiny of a show more than the principal player or players who have to come to work every day. One of the great hallmarks of $6 Million Man and later Bionic Woman was the sound effect. I would like to pay tribute to an unsung hero whose name was on the screen, but nobody reads credits except the people who worked on the show. There was a guy at Universal who was head of the sound editing department. His name was Jim Troutman. Jim, who had many, many shows to supervise, took special interest in the opening episodes of our show. He did the eye and the ears when Jamie had ears, and all sounds in between. And I used to think, I said, Jim, I don't know where you're finding these sounds, but they're wonderful. And they were. There was storytelling. Some years later, I am watching a movie that most everyone has seen, one of my favorites, Airplane. Airplane was sound edited by Jim Troutman, my revered friend. And I caught something that apparently no one else had ever caught, or so he said. Every time there was a long shot of airplane in flight, an exterior airplane, it was a jet. But the sound was not a jet. The sound was a reciprocating airplane engine. And I thought that was hysterical. Now, only I would think that that was very funny because I know what he went through to make sounds vivid, interesting, and so forth. So I called Jim up and I said, Jim, you put a prop sound over a jet airplane. He said, you noticed, nobody's noticed. And that was his great joke. And to this day, I watch Airplane just to hear the sound over the airplane long shot. I'm very flattered. To know that you've done something that people received and remember is great. I have one. I have my own parody. I was at a wedding of a friend, and I was asked to say a few words. You know, I was best man, so forth. Took up the microphone and I said, John Doe, astronaut, a man barely alive, and the laugh covered the ballroom. So yes, I think parody is fun. Well, I'd love to think it was me, but it was only me as part of a family. There was a great family feeling. I think of all the shows I've been involved with, it was the one with the least friction between people, both crew and cast. There was a great affection between the creative team and the performing team. There was a sense of joy. And I think it shows in many, if not all, of the episodes. And personally, when I left Universal, they threw a lovely party for me and gave me a trophy. And knowing that I love the military, which I do, they called me Cominch Bion Gru, which is one of those military abbreviations meaning Commander-in-Chief Bionic Group. And the inscription was, thank you for the pleasure of serving with you. I cried. I cried. I think that the reverence for the military, which certainly I did bring to our group, and also remembering that the opening footage and the entire story is based on something that happened at Edwards Air Force Base. They responded in kind. I had had good dealings with the military public relations people when I was on Mod Squad. In fact, I'd done a Mod Squad episode that dealt with My Lai, the massacre. And it was approved by the public relations people at the Army because it was done with a certain understanding, I hope, and respect. That carried over, and the commandant at Edwards Air Force Base was so helpful. I got to fly with the Thunderbirds. For a pilot, what is greater than that? And we shot there, and we had some astronaut technical assistance in our space and astronautic episodes. And as I think I mentioned, Bruce Peterson, who was the original crash victim bionic person, was a guest on our set and a friend of mine whenever we met. I enjoyed it. enormously. Had I not had a vision problem, I would have been a military flyer instead of a infantry corporal. So there's my little dream. I had done a movie of the week prior to prior to 6 Mil, which was called Houston, We Got a Problem, which should tell you what the movie was all about. We shot in Houston. I made great relationships with all the NASA chieftains, and they're a great bunch of people. And that relationship persisted. And when we started doing, of all things, an astronaut barely alive, they were very happy to help us whenever we needed them. We didn't need them a lot, but when we did, there they were. God bless them. Ken Johnson has an incredible imagination. And when he said, we got to do Bigfoot and so forth, I said, I think we're over the line. And I was resistant at first. Not heavily, because when Ken has an idea, you don't stand in his way too much. So finally he convinced me, and it was all his stuff. I take no responsibility except for having enjoyed the rough cut. I think it represents one polarity of what we did on 6 Mil, and that polarity was a little bit campy, a little bit for fun, a little bit exaggerated. I think I mentioned my favorite scene was when Steve Austin lifts up a car as a human jack, okay? That's campy too. It's saying, hey folks, we don't take ourselves that seriously. Maybe there's a Bigfoot, maybe there's not. But if there were, you'd make a great opponent for Steve Austin. I think that because of the nature of the show, we could do things that you couldn't do on any other television show. And to that extent, they were iconic and they were fun. At that moment in showbiz history, toy connections were not common as they became later. So in a sense, we pioneered that too. I had a couple of meetings with Kenner. We ran film for them. We showed them, we indoctrinated them as to what the show was all about. And that was the limit of our connection. I think we had one meeting where they came in with some drawings of lunch boxes and not bobbleheads, but the equivalent of bobblehead dolls. And we just nodded. It was great. I had a lunchbox for my son and daughter. And I don't think I had any action figures, but the lunchboxes were well used. It was a revolution in a way. It created the demand for toys from shows or movies that persists and grows to this day. Whenever people say, well, you're a science fiction guy, my answer is always no, I'm about heroes, whether they are male, female. I mean, Bionic Woman and Golda Meir may not seem to have much in common, but they are both heroines of epic proportions. I think my take on science fiction is that I grew up at a time where science fiction was principally pessimistic. War of the Worlds, Arch Oboler, Ray Bradbury. These are terrible things that are going to happen to us in the future, largely. When it came my turn to do something in that field, I returned to the heroic base, but essentially to the belief that things will get better, not worse. That may be a cockeyed, optimistic tomfoolery, but it's what I believe. In my later career, that's what attracted me to Star Trek. that it, as a television show, said it would be in the 23rd century that things will be fine, will be exploratory, will be good. So that's the link between me and the heroism of my youth that I admired and Six Male and Bionic Woman. It's going to be better. I think it was one of a kind. You can't label it a sci-fi show. You can't label it a superhero show, because every time you do that, there are too many exceptions to those labels. I think the combination of fun and adventure made it different than any other heroic type show, especially at the time. Things got darker again in the 70s and 80s, and are especially dark on television now. I think there was also a certain personal charm that Lee projected, that Lindsay projected, which made you want to know them, to invite them over, to have a beer with them, like that. They had a family quality. And I know it's a weird comparison, but maybe it was a family show after all. My fan experience has been rather entirely because of my later association with Star Trek. I have gone to Star Trek conventions, and of course those conventions are now so generic to all things that the last Star Trek convention I went to, there was a $6 million representation. So my response to the fans that have conventions and so forth, I think it's marvelous, and I think it's a great support mechanism. But sometimes it goes over the edge, you know, uniforms and such. Fortunately, in 6 Mil, I've never experienced the kind of radicalism that you get in a Star Trek convention. Maybe someday with the release of these new, clean, wonderful episodes, maybe there'll be a convention I'd like to go to. As I look back on the 6 weeks from zero to on the air, folks, with a series that then becomes a success, I try to remember what was a blur. How do we do it? How did this group of people coalesce together and do the impossible? One of the words in use recently, insofar as presidents and retiring people and so forth, is legacy. It's an overused word. But if I have a legacy, it begins with 6 Mil, and to have people know about it or experience it again, it's enormously flattering. And you feel like maybe you did something that people might enjoy.